So about a decade ago, I was climbing a mountain with a friend. It's actually more like a hike, not really up a mountain, but it was just kind of a path near a mountain. But we were walking together, and I wanted to ask my friend a question. My friend is a soldier, a commander. He's been to war. I'm pretty much the opposite. I'm a law professor. I've commanded no one. The only wars I've ever had is with bureaucrats and bean counters. So he is basically the opposite of me, and I was interested in understanding something about his experience, in particular, the soldiers who served with him. So I said, who are they? Why are they there? And he said, what do you mean, Larry? I said, well, what are they doing? What's their purpose? And he said, well, they want to serve something bigger than themselves, but not smaller than this country. They fight for, he said, democracy. And then he said something which has stuck with me for this last decade. He said, no one goes to war for a political party. And immediately when he said that, I had this little quibble in the back of my head. Maybe actually the Civil War was a war over a party, but I put that aside and I wanted to focus on what was really important about what he said. This strange and beautiful idea of civic service above or beyond party. That before we were Republicans, before we were Democrats, we were citizens first. Now, this is new for me. I've spent the last decade, I've thought of myself as a kind of soldier, citizen soldier for democracy. I've been fighting my wars for democracy so we can get things like climate change legislation or healthcare legislation or a new and sustainable minimum wage. These things which people associate, and rightly so, with the Democratic Party. But what his statement has made me think over the last decade is that we need not citizen soldiers fighting for a party. We need citizen soldiers fighting for a democracy that is beyond party, that is above party, that is focused on citizens first. And as I thought about what that could be, what is the way of understanding what's wrong with this democracy that could unite people on the left and the right, I came to an uncomfortable idea. The idea is equality. Now, it's uncomfortable because this idea is associated with all sorts of complicated and controversial fights I believe in, but not everyone necessarily together. Fights about racial equality, fights about sex equality, sexual orientation equality, income equality, speech equality. These weren't the equalities I was talking about. It wasn't identity politics that I was focused on, unless it's an identity politics for citizens. It's an equality that recognizes the political equality that a democracy is supposed to promise each of us, that we are supposed to be equal as citizens in a democracy, which means our power as citizens is to be the same. And that idea triggered me because right now we are not anywhere close to equal as citizens. I mean, here are the ways in which we are not equal as citizens. Do we have an equal access to vote across the country? The answer is no. Across the country, for both Democrats and Republicans, there are techniques to suppress the votes of the party that's not in power. Last year, according to Charles Stewart at MIT, 16 million people suffered the inequality of access to vote because of these techniques. And if this is all the people in America, this is 16 million of the voters who suffered that inequality. Do we have an equal vote for the president? Obviously, no. First, because of the Electoral College, which allocates votes according to not population, but some weird formula the framers came up with. So, for example, Wyoming has 3 electors, and California has 55, which means every single vote in Wyoming is equal to 18 votes in California. That's unequal. But much more important is a system that Maine actually doesn't follow, the system of winner take all, where the election in a state, the electors in a state get allocated according to who wins the popular vote. The popular vote winner gets all of the Electoral College vote winners. And what that means is that presidential campaigns are focused on what's called battleground states. In 2016, candidates spent 95% in these 14 states, 95% of their time, and 99% of campaign spending. You're thinking, where were they for the other 5% of the time? Well, they're basically in California and New York raising money from rich people so they could afford their campaigns. But the rest of their campaigns were in the battleground states, which means that if you weren't in a battleground state and you didn't happen to vote the winner of your state, your vote just didn't matter, which means that 52 million Americans voted only to have their vote thrown away by the process of the winner-take-all in the Electoral College. Do we have an equal vote in Congress? No. In the House of Representatives, this thing called safe seat gerrymandering dominates how our districts are drawn. Out of 435 seats, only 45 are competitive, which means that in the rest, candidates run in safe seats, both Democratic and Republican safe seats, which means that the only people those candidates care about or fear are challenges from their own party. Which means if you happen to be a Republican in a Democratic safe seat or a Democrat in a Republican safe seat, your view just does not matter. So in Massachusetts in the last election, 1 million people voted Republican. They got 0 representatives in the House of Representatives. Which means if you add up the safe seat minority votes, the people who are minorities in these safe seats, 89 million Americans' votes just were not equal. Or what about the Senate? Right, well, this is the obvious one. This is the one where, of course, every state gets 2 senators, and every state is obviously not equal. So, again, Wyoming, and it really does tilt to the right. If you look on the map, it does tilt to the right like that, and California leans far to the left. But for every vote in Wyoming, it's the equivalent of 67 votes for Senate in California, which means if you add up the unequal votes that this system produces, 161 million Americans have an unequal representation vote power in this system. Or what about the equal power to vote? And of course, in America, power is money. The answer again here is obviously no. Candidates for Congress and members of Congress spend anywhere between 30% and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress. Dialing for dollars. For the kids in there, that's a telephone, this device right here. Dialing for dollars, calling people across the country to raise the money they need to get back to Congress. But they're not calling the average American. They're calling the tiniest fraction of the 1%. No more than 100,000 Americans give even the maximum contribution to one candidate. As they do this, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. This 100,000 Americans who are the large funders of these campaigns, they have the power over the representatives who bend their life to suck up to them, meaning the 199 million of the rest of us have unequal power in the power to select our Congress. Okay, so if you add all these things up, if you're a Harvard professor, you know that means add it all up. I learned that from my 10-year-old son, but that's what that means. Add it all up. Add these 4 things up. What this means is that citizens in America are not equal. that we were trained, we were told, we were taught in school that this is the picture of democracy in America, we, the citizens, driving the bus, but here's the reality of democracy in America. The steering wheel has been removed from the bus because of this inequality, because we are unequal. Those who have the unequal power drive this bus. Now, this is a problem, but it's an invisible problem. This is invisible. Well, actually, this would be a better picture of invisible. So imagine there's a thing there that's invisible, right? This is an invisible problem. Because unlike other fights for equality in the history of American civil rights movements, this fight, this problem, this inequality is basically unseen in America today. It's unseen because we don't have it pressed in our face. Think about the most inspirational and tragic struggle for equality in the history of America, the struggle of African Americans to achieve both first freedom and then equality as citizens in America. For 400 years, that struggle went on, and the thing about that struggle was that at no moment in that struggle were African Americans confused about whether the system was treating them unequally. They got it. At every moment, they recognized the system was not treating them equally. But in that, they had an advantage because we, especially people like me, white males, we don't see it. We don't notice it. It doesn't confront us, hit us in the face every day. It's the carbon monoxide of democracy. It's odorless and tasteless and invisible, but deadly to a democracy, because what it does is destroy the capacity of a democracy to respond to what its people care about. And the consequence of this is that regardless of your issue, whether it's on the left or on the right, whatever issue you might care about, whatever issue you want to fight for most, you need to recognize we will get nothing until we fix this inequality first. So how do you fix it? Now, this is the struggle I've had over the last decade. Because as I've been fighting, I've been recognizing that building the energy, the movement for such a fight is incredibly hard. But as I've thought through this, I've recognized the way we fix it is to forget about what we will get if we solve this inequality and focus instead on what we can give. And give not to us, but give to our kids. So I have a friend who married the love of her life. She's a Mainer. She moved out west, and they had 2 beautiful boys. And when the boys were approaching teenagehood, their father sat them down, and he wanted to have a conversation with them. And the conversation he wanted to have was a conversation about what they should do when they are approached by a police officer. Now, my friend was puzzled about this conversation. She stopped him and said, what are you doing? And he said, no responsible father does not tell his sons how they are to respond when they are approached by a police officer. You see, my friend is white, and her husband is black, and their children are mixed race. And what she was seeing in the most emotionally jarring way she could see was that though they were wealthy, though they were comfortable, though they had done everything they can to protect their children, this they could not protect their children from. And she felt the inequality. And she had this emotion, this reaction, and I saw it as she wept, as she told me this story. And as I wept, as I listened to this story, the emotion she felt was 2 parts. One, the outrageousness that still, to this day, this is the reality that her children would have to face, that any child would have to face. I'm not talking about the police officers. That's a different issue. I'm talking about her and this emotion in this recognition. So that's number one, the outrageousness. And then number two, the commitment she had, because of the love of her children, to do everything she could to fight the inequality that made this true. If we are ever to find a way to fight the inequality that is our democracy, we need all of us to have that love for our children too. Each of us must look into the eyes of our children and recognize that though we inherited a democracy that the world could be proud of, we are passing to our children a broken and corrupted and unequal democracy. And unless we step up and do something to fight to get that democracy back, then all the problems that we see, problems on the left and problems on the right, all the problems that we see, we pass on to them unrepaired. We have to step up, not for us, but for love of country, and for love of them. Because this democracy has failed. On our watch, it has failed. It's our responsibility to fix it. Thank you very much.